In response to these troubling developments, four opposition parties that signed President Salome Zurabishvili's Georgian charter have alleged electoral fraud, boycotted the results, and vowed not to enter what they deem an illegitimate parliament. Today, we're joined by Nino Dolidze, Executive Director of International Society for Fair Elections and Democracy, John DiPiero, Georgia Program Director from International Republican Institute, and Eka Aishelashvili, a distinguished visiting fellow at GMF and a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Georgia. As we engage with our distinguished speakers, we will delve into the implications of these contested results and explore the crucial role that international partners can play in supporting Georgia's democratic aspirations moving forward. Before we delve into our discussion, I would like to remind everyone to please type any questions you have into the chat box as we go along. We will gather them together and address as many as possible during our Q&A session at the end of the panel. We really look forward to your thoughts and questions. Kicking it off, I would like to give the floor to Nino. We've seen preliminary reports from both local and international observers indicating that elections did not occur under free or fair conditions. The Georgian president, as well as pro-European opposition parties, have even called the election results illegitimate, while Georgian Dream MPs refuse these allegations, insisting that people have really chosen them. As the head of Georgia's leading election watchdog, could you please share your perspective on the election process, specifically highlighting the most concerning irregularities leading up to and then on the election day?
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Elena, for this opportunity. And I'm really happy that you are interested in Georgia's parliamentary elections, which was, of course, very crucial for our country. And unfortunately, it was not assessed neither free nor fair. And yeah, I will try to briefly explain how ISFED observed these elections and what are our main findings. So first of all, let me start from saying that whenever we are assessing elections, we should not concentrate only on election day, because whatever our findings were, it was based on election day as well as pre-election period. So let me start from the pre-election period, which very much affected on election day and was connected to the results what we have received. First, of course, I want to start from the Russian law, which was adopted in pre-election period, which hindered process of election observation organization. And of course, when we have seen demonizing election observer organization, calling them enemy, of course, it affected on the quality and work of civil society and election observer organizations. We have not been talking about it loudly, but of course, for us, it was big problem, recruitment of people, especially in regions, because they were intimidated, pressured not to be part of domestic civil society organizations. And we have lots of cases of that. Second big thing in pre-election period, what we have seen was unprecedented high anti-Western narratives, which was never a case in any elections in Georgia. Unfortunately, we have been hearing Eurosceptic and anti-Western narratives from the government, conspiracy theories, and all this global war party, which of course was affecting the narratives and messages of pre-election period. Another issue was problematic, which we saw ruling parties' narratives about banning opposition political parties, which we consider anti-democratic narrative, because there is no democracy without different political parties. And of course, this narrative was damaging pre-election period. And also we had increased Russia's information interference in Georgia's space, especially in information space. You probably have seen Meta's report. Meta deleted Russian network, coordinated inauthentic network, which was trying to support ruling party in Georgia and was against civil society organizations and opposition. And this investigation was, by the way, now also based on ISFED investigation, because we have been also looking at coordinated inauthentic behavior. Another problem was use of administrative resources and legal changes in favor of ruling party. We have seen many legal amendments, legislative amendments, especially about the election administration composition and their decision-making process. For example, first biggest problem was changing the composition rule, which was allowing ruling party to have so-called professional members with simple majority in election administration, Central Election Commission, which was criticized not only from domestic actors, but also from OSCE, ODIHR, and Venice Commission, because it is very much important to have trust towards election administration, and trust is ensured when different political parties in parliament support election administration. It was our demand to have at least 2/3 support from the political parties in parliament, but unfortunately it happened. Another was decreasing the decision-making quorum in the Central Election Commission, enabling Central Election Commission to make changes in decrees or whatever with a simple majority. And one of the serious changes was in a decree about the distributing tasks for commission members, on the polling station commission members, which in many years was happening on election day in order to have it transparent so that observers are also observing. But unfortunately, it was changed by the Central Election Commission with their decisions. And it happened 1 week prior. And why it was problematic? Because of several reasons. Because first, we could not observe in 3,000 polling stations in pre-election period distribution of the tasks among commission members. And then there was 1 week for the intimidation and pressure on those commission members to make them do whatever may be needed. I'm not saying that it happened 100%, but we don't have evidence that it didn't, and this time was used for that. Another big thing was use of administrative resources, as I said, for the ruling party in pre-election period. We have seen mobilization of public servants on ruling party events, and most problematic was that we had again leak of collecting dossiers about people's personal information and people's vulnerability. And then it was used for election purposes, to use it whether to intimidate, threaten, or buy the voters. And this leak means that there is continued efforts of what we have seen 2 years ago. If you have seen, ISFED and TI together issued big report based on the deputy head of state security services, Toso Gogashvili's file, so-called, which was showing the scale of state institutions being involved in collecting personal information about people and then using it for electoral purposes. And last thing about pre-election period was that we had numerous cases coming from different regions about confiscation of IDs from the people. Like people were confiscated or in exchange of money taken ID cards, which was, of course, the case that these people could not vote anymore. So it was voter suppression, of course, or this ID could be used from different person in favor of any party, but from the different purpose. So why I mentioned these things for the pre-election period? Because whatever we have seen on election day, it was very much connected. And what we saw on election day, ISFED had, our mission was 1,500 observers. We were on the polling station with static observers, but also looking outside the polling stations, and we had out-of-country observers as well. And from our observers, first I should say that ISFED had not received so many incidents for a long time period of observing elections. It was so many phone calls coming about the incident that we couldn't even respond to all of them. And we have seen combination of so many heavy incidents, which we haven't seen again for a while. It was ballot-stuffing, it was multiple voting, it was voting again, instead of other person, problems with the inking. And for example, to compare, we had 9% now problems with the inking, which is directly indicating the carousel, right? If people is not inked, this person may go to another place. And during the last elections, it was less than 1%. So it was huge increase in the inking process. Then kicking out our observers, and it was very widespread. And also our observers had problems to observe voter verification problems. So like it was many problems together happening. And because we had this multiple voting instead of others, or carousel voting, we believe that this pre-election period confiscation of IDs or collection of the personal information was of course used for election day. And what we are saying is that according to Georgia's constitution, Georgia's parliament should be elected on a basis of universal, free, equal, direct suffrage by the secret ballot. And we say that these elections failed to meet 4 of these 5 basic principles. Because it was not universal. When we are talking about, for example, Georgian diaspora, they were asking for more polling stations than the Central Election Commission did not open more polling stations for them. And also, whenever we observed our diaspora voting, many of them couldn't vote because polling stations were so small and not enough commission members there. It was lines, and probably who are abroad, you have seen how big lines it was, for example, in New York or other cities. Some people had to just leave and go back without voting. So this we call a violation of the universal suffrage because people had problems in that. When we are talking about the equal right means one voter, one vote. But because we had multiple voting, because we had some people voting for another or carousel voting, we are saying that it was violation of equal principle of the voting. Or when we are talking about free, it was not free because we have 31% of polling station when people were tracked by the ruling party activists or coordinators. They were standing outside the outside the polling stations, and we have been seeing how people were tracked, who has come, who has not, etc. And we have 13% of polling station where ISFED observers found alleged vote buying cases. So we cannot call elections free when will of the people is controlled. And finally, the biggest challenge what we saw was the secrecy of the vote. Because with these new electronic technologies, there was big campaign saying that technologies do not read and do not show who people vote for. But unfortunately, we saw the paper itself, which was allowing to show from the back whom people voted for, based on the numbers of the political parties which we had in the ballot paper. And now many organizations are challenging this in the courts, like secrecy of the vote, because it's one of the fundamental principles, and because secrecy of the vote is used against people to threaten them, intimidate it. It was violated in these elections hugely and heavily. One, as I said, with this paper, but we have also seen photo taken to the ballot papers or people accompanying voters to enter ballot box booths, etc. So I do not want to continue too much and take others' time, but what we saw, it was combination of many schemes together, which we haven't seen for a long time. It was voter suppression in some of the cases, creating problems for people, controlling the free will of the people. At the end of the day, what ISFED said that because of the problems, what we have seen in pre-election period and on election day, it impacted the expression of free will of the voters, and therefore these elections results cannot be seen as a reflection of the will of Georgian voters. This is very shortly, and of course, I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for sharing all of that. And I would also urge our participants, those who are interested, to definitely check their report, the preliminary report on ISFED's social media, their website. Some of the things that Nino discussed about is also available for those interested. Moving on to John, so IRI's preliminary report as well highlights severe irregularities that undermine the fairness of the election process. There is mention of voter intimidation and structural barriers with the electoral system. If you could tell us more about that, as well as based on these findings, what does IRI see as the most pressing response that the international community, but particularly the United States, should adopt?
Sure. Thank you, Elena, and thank you to GMF for inviting me to be here. I'll start by just saying that I very much share many of Nino's assessments. ISFED does tremendous work, and they really are. They have the widest scope and view possible in this country as far as observation missions are concerned. So they did a really tremendous job, and I think uncovering a lot of these issues. And of course, their findings very much check out with many of ours. Elena, to your point, the big two elements that we noted through the pre-election period, and I think ours was the largest and longest of the international long-term missions, One was, of course, the element of lawfare. This is a more broad technical term, but it's ultimately the usage of unprecedented use of political and legal changes which constrain political competition. This, of course, in turn kind of created an uneven electoral playing field. And so when we talk about the use of state resources, you start to think about elements like weaponization of state institutions and how those are used to ultimately, reduce the participation or ultimately, technically suppress political or civic actors from being vocal or participating. This was further sort of augmented by the restrictions on media access, and of course, I'd say this was done pretty expertly and quite effectively. The other big piece, though, was the intimidation factor, and that one was really hard to look away from. And I think our report focused a lot on that. Our observers noted and as Nino already mentioned, whisper campaigns, whereby let's say the election commissions would say quite publicly, the technology is safe, it is secret. But then privately, there were many reports consistently all across the country to our own observers, where locally elected officials or party representatives essentially noted to the public that, no, your vote, in fact, is not secret, and we are going to know how you vote, how your family members vote, how your community votes. So this is a psychological pressure that's oftentimes applied to voters and their families. And I think in many ways also combined with this, what was a narrative that was very prevalent and strong from the ruling party on war versus peace, was very, very effective in terms of planting that seed with voters so that they were really not sure whether they could, in fact, trust the system. And then when you kind of flash that forward to election day, and there was a lot of reports already, ourselves included, of these sort of corridors of fear. There's a Georgian term, illegitimate, but the kind of tough guys outside of the polling stations. They know you, they're in your community. People who may or may not have trusted those whisper campaigns are now going and realizing they are being watched. And then that carried on into the election or the polling station, where there were cameras set up everywhere and they were pointed directly at the machinery. So the notion of secrecy was actually quite undermined. And I would say, this I think scared voters into making what they didn't necessarily believe was a free choice. Having said all this, irregularities and manipulations, though they've been observed at many individual levels, the ability to demonstrate that this took place at scale and system-wide is always the biggest challenge. I'll shift for just a minute because I do want to discuss the actual results themselves, and I think that's relevant for an organization like ours. Many people noted the exit polls and the stark contrast between them. There were two fairly reputable firms who had, the ruling party anywhere between 40, 41, 42%, and the opposition ranging between 48 to 52% when the exit polls came out. This was in contrast to a fairly not very reputable firm, let's just say, that had significantly inflated numbers, and then those ended up being much closer to what the Central Election Commission's numbers were. I think collectively the opposition got just over 37% and the ruling party just over 53%. But from the perspective of an organization that does polls as part of our work, and with sort of in-depth knowledge of what the actual numbers of supporters are by each party, it is a little bit hard to believe when you consider that you have a group of people who are, after 12 years, they're just simply the least popular they've ever been, and that those numbers reduced over the last 6 months, following a number of developments here in country. They even lost probably up to another 100,000 votes just from Gacharia's party alone. And then to look at the overall turnout and realize they got more than 200,000 votes above their best day, right? Above how they did in 2020, which was about 930,000 votes. So again, when you're just adding up the numbers, it does make it a little bit harder to believe that they had such a performance. But perhaps the intimidation factor played such a role in that. And of course, there are other allegations, which Nino already touched on. Getting in more to the political elements of this and sort of the opportunities or the responses, in the last week, the opposition's sort of whole case has been built on whether or not they can prove widespread fraud. We do know that to some degrees this happened. Certainly, there were pieces that just recently came out as recently as yesterday on TV Tbilisi that I guess demonstrated to some degrees across, let's say, ethnic minority communities, cases of vote buying, pressure, intimidation, and even double voting. But that, again, that burden of proof being met at a national widespread scale is of course, again, much more difficult for the opposition. And to be able to get to where they want to be, it will likely require an international, as they're calling it, impartial investigation. And that, of course, hinges on the government being willing to cooperate. And that even further then hinges on them being incentivized or willing to do so. And if you're them, are you going to invite in a bunch of people to investigate a potentially fraudulent case that you say never happened, right? So that part is their first challenge. The second is whistleblowers. There are some, but they are isolated, and this would need to be, I think, uncovered at a much wider scale. And then lastly, I think you're looking at sort of a Washington and a Brussels posture that is ready to then apply additional pressure and restrictions on the Georgian government. So you've got a bit of a chicken or an egg situation here, where the West is unwilling to take these steps without sufficient evidence, and the opposition cannot sufficiently acquire that evidence unless the West applies pressure, right? So right now, Georgian Dream has all the leverage. And keeping that point in mind, the opposition probably has around two options available to them if we're simplifying it. If opposition and observers are unable to provide sufficient evidence to motivate, the West to apply additional restrictions or measures, then they either make a deal to take up their seats, or they just sort of remain in this posture of indefinite protest. As my other colleagues can tell you tonight, will probably give us an idea of what that size looks like. There's a protest that's beginning in just an hour or so, and we'll see how long that lasts and how large it is. The flip side to that, though, is that if there is sufficient evidence, then the government may take more harsh or crackdown type measures on protesters. That could be parties or CSOs or media. We've definitely seen that happen before, and we saw it happen in spring and early summer of 2024. Having said that, I think they'd rather situation moved quietly. So if we look at kind of where the international partners might be, or particularly those from European capitals and from the US, I think these matters are all complicated by two main pieces. The first is the government's continued insistence that European integration is not only on the table, but that it is alive and well, and that they are pursuing it. The second is the Georgian government's projected sort of reset with the US. I think while Georgian Dream would prefer the quiet route, where everyone sort of takes a deal and takes up their seats, and this all allows them to sort of operate unchallenged, relatively unchallenged going forward. If they have to take an extreme route, they have demonstrated in the past they're prepared to do so. But if they do so, then that whole notion of reset and European integration are sort of off the table, right? At least under the current political configurations within the US and the EU. So a lot of this is now riding on what happens within the US elections, or at least the perception of what happens, and that's being talked about a lot. So I would just close by maybe stating that there's a lot of questions here on the ground about what the US or the EU is going to do. And if this is just me, of course, now with my own assessment and what we've obviously discussed with our diplomatic partners and the different missions here, but I would guess they wouldn't do a great deal at present, right? They've made their offer to the Georgian government. That has existed well before this election took place. And I think a lot of any steps towards each other will be incumbent on whether the Georgian Dream government is willing to take more steps towards the West. So if I was guessing, I would think they would use some of these anti-democratic and some would say repressive pieces of legislation, the Foreign Agents Law, the anti-LGBTQI legislation, as sort of bargaining chips to ultimately kind of reset relations. And again, a lot of that relies on the strength and evidence and willingness of the opposition to take their seats. So at the moment, the sides are at an impasse, and these next weeks may demonstrate just some movement, but we'll have to wait and see. I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Elena. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you for sharing your insights. We definitely appreciate that. And before we open up for Q&A session, I would like to once again remind our participants that please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A box that is visible for everyone on the bottom of your screen. And of course, we're going to make sure to take your questions in the end. And I would like to go to Eka to give her floor for her expertise and analysis of the result of the elections, to also tell us what does it mean when it comes to a larger context, when it comes to EU's immediate neighborhood, and perhaps I will just add one more question here. If we operate on the premise that the election results were manipulated, what strategic steps should the opposition take to position itself effectively, sort of to avoid the recurrence of the 2020 political crisis that we witnessed in Georgia? Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you, Elena, and then thank you for having this conversation today. And I'm afraid it's not going to be the first, and it's not going to be the last one. Maybe that we might be forced to have with the audience like we have today. When I'll start with one thing, and I speak here, I have to emphasize that I'm not a member of any party. I'm not included now in any political movement myself. And then just to make it clear that I'm not part of any conversations when it comes to strategizing from an opposition side of what needs to be done. I look at what happens right now as a citizen, first of all, of Georgia, but then person that has quite a bit of an experience how previously state building process worked in Georgia, and then how the foreign relations of Georgia have been in place, so to say, for decades for now. So based on that, first observation, no elections in any country happen in vacuum. And it's not just what Nino rightfully mentioned when it comes to pre-election and electoral day and then in aftermaths of that. But the elections happen in a political and social sort of infrastructure and framework. And then even beyond the pre-electoral time that is considered to be long-term observation time for any elections, we just need to realize that if we are honest about definitions here, Georgia is for quite some time now a captured state. I mean, there is clarity of that. But there are no checks and balances when it comes to legislature, judicial power, and then executives. It is all consolidated in the very strict power vertical that starts or ends with Bidzina Ivanishvili, and then in the way how Georgian Dream is running the country as a privatized or captured state. And this is very important because well beyond the time frame that precedes the electoral process, we have to understand that the level of intimidation, pressure, dependency on the social subsidies of so many in the regions, all of that is into play, leading to the electoral process. And why I'm emphasizing that against that backdrop, what Georgian people did during the election day, how much they've mobilized inside of Georgia and outside of Georgia. And then, I understand that there needs to be proof, reports, and gatherings. But I'm sorry, John, the scale of the violations is pretty obvious for everybody in Georgia right now. It's a nationwide scale of fraud and stealing of elections of a kind that was rarely seen in this country way before sort of the democracy started to be part of our reality, imperfect as it is, but still. So figures as they came at the exit polls, and I'm not claiming here that they are one-to-one sort of correct, perhaps in the way that how the actual votes went into, against the backdrop of all the intimidation, harassment, change of legislation, all of that, and then limited opportunity for people to vote outside of Georgia, and I'll pay more attention to that in a second. On the election day, Georgian Dream, in terms of simple arithmetics, lost election. And this was at the expense of very strong mobilization of the Georgian people, and then they understanding why these elections mattered. And it's not about the fact whether or not Georgia will pursue its pathway to EU only. It's about sovereignty of this country for which so many of us in different generations in Georgia have fought for. There is quite clarity right now in Georgia, even among Georgians that have actually voted for Georgian Dream, that they do have a Russian vector. And it's a fake premise that they have an intention to join EU or pursue that pathway. It's just a game in which they try to consolidate power and limit the pressure that be, or any reaction from the West whenever that is needed, or play with that card of seeming intention of joining EU and NATO for internal political reasons. And this is very important to understand, because when we speak now about what needs to be done inside of Georgia or outside of Georgia, there needs to be this realization that any decision of that kind involves a question: are we leaving Georgian people alone, or are we giving a chance of fighting for their sovereignty and freedom? And there are many ways how, assistance of that kind could be provided to this country, but it's not about the opposition. It's not about the Georgian dream. It's about the Georgian people that did everything they could, coming out and voting to vote out Georgian dream from the position where they are right now, and then the vote has been stolen. And with that, potentially for quite some time, their future, if there will be some kind of a deal between the opposition of the Georgian dream, and then something that could normalize this abnormal situation, as it has been done, by the way, under the international pressure, particularly EU in 2020. We all have deja vu of 2020, and you had this in your question. In 2020, there were very credible claims about falsification of the election results. Opposition was mobilized, and our international partners did everything, to be honest, to legitimize somehow the situation and having a normalization of what otherwise was a political impasse. Did it lead to anything good after that? Did we have an improvement? Did we have an implementation of all these recommendations that came out from Charles Michel's decision, for example, at the time? Anything that was at the time a hope, as it seemed, that perhaps with that normalization of situation, we could have had a better normalcy in terms of actual development of the situation on the ground. No, we had actually a reversal of all of that. So if there is any glimpse of a hope that if opposition goes into the parliament, there is a tacit agreement of somewhat normalization, and then, they will recall back these laws. And by the way, all of it, what is happening in Georgia, it's not only about these laws. There might not be a Russian law in some time in the future, but it will not radically change the situation in this country. We all understand that in Georgia. It's just a fake understanding that as if these laws are out, Georgia's political system is becoming somewhat normal. We have lost what is the key for any democracy. For a democracy to be a democracy, it needs to be an electoral democracy to begin with. And we don't have now results of the elections that are reflective of the free choice of the Georgian population in this case. And until that is remedied, there cannot be no real normalization of the situation in Georgia. On my end, when it comes to the sort of a lawyer's position, public international lawyer's position, a person that has been engaged in different political processes before, person that is very much engaged and is looking into the developments in the region, including in our neighborhood, and then in wider sort of Eastern Europe, as it is called. Without the snap elections, there could be no normalization of the democratic development in this country, because if this parliament that is a result of the stolen elections will become the foundation of the next stage of democratic governance of Georgia, then we will have no real democracy. It will be a fake process when it comes to political legitimacy, and we will impose this on the Georgian people to accept this as the only reality we can have, as if we don't deserve to have a democratic reality in this country. And at least we need to be honest about it. So I understand that sometimes the leverage or potential of changing anything from outside is difficult, and I'm not pleading that it needs to be changed from outside, but at least we need to be honest about it, that there's not that much that needs to be done, or can be done, much alike to what happens in Venezuela right now. Everybody understands that Maduro is a dictator right now. He stole the elections. Nobody can unseat him right now, right? Neither from inside and then from outside. But at least everybody understands that he is not a legitimately elected president of the country, and he's a dictator. So if we will have to bear as Georgian citizens the reality of having a Georgian dream in the governing position, at least there needs to be clarity of that. And no prospect of non-electoral democracy could be there as a real prospect when it comes to EU integration process. He was very clear about that. So what are we talking about? That the country cannot have a real election, and then countries still can pursue the EU integration process that runs contrary to everything that the EU stands for. And let's have a look what happened in Moldova quite recently. That was a battlefield when it comes to how much effort a sitting president and the government had to do to defend their voting right in a country that is not currently captured by any oligarch, unlike to the previous times when Plakhatniuk or Shor were in a position to govern the country. It is a sitting president that is democratic president that is pro-EU and, generally a very, very much a fighter when it comes to democratic development of the country. They had to go extra mile to ensure that even in the condition when the state is not captured by an oligarch, they could actually maintain that trajectory of development, because the level of pressure engagement in this hybrid way from Russia was immense. So if anybody looks into the results in Georgia right now, don't think that it's Georgian people that are puzzled right now. The Georgian people did not vote out Georgian Dream, and they did not choose EU or democratic development in this country. We as a small nation have been wrestled, and very strongly with that, by Russia, not only through the partial occupation as it is of the 20% of our territory, but having a government that captured the state that is very much linked with Russia. And that's a reality. From geopolitical point of view, or from any point of view that we look into it, we need to be open about it. So we don't see through the prism of fake possibilities how it could normalize the situation. And if we are not able to change anything, at least we need to acknowledge that. And we'll see what happens today in the streets, and then what will be the continuation of all of that. But it's a moment when there is quite a bit of disillusionment when it comes to what are the options for fighting this reality from inside of Georgia among the ordinary citizens, which thought that their expression of free will would have been recognized better, to be honest, from outside of Georgia as well. The Georgian people actually voted this dream out. And so far, what I'm hearing still by many is as if, it's almost like a 50-50 coin at some point. And if the Georgian people did not vote as they voted Georgian Dream out. And it was a decisive, in that sense, against the backdrop where and how they could vote, including many thousands of Georgians outside of Georgia not even being able to cast the vote. But still, with all the restrictions that Nino articulated as well, it's clear the Georgian Dream, even in that context, lost. So let's don't speak about Georgian people being confused and then being intimidated and all of that. We voted them out. Now we need to have a possibility of defending our vote and defending our sovereignty in the future. And at least being clear about that, what are we talking about, rather than some imaginary possibilities of normalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Eka, very much. Some very sobering thoughts that you put on the table for all of us to think about. Being mindful of the time as well, I suggest that we move for the Q&A session. I already see that we do have a couple of questions, and just a reminder for our participants that please go ahead and also insert questions in the Q&A chat box if you do have one. So the first one that I'm seeing is regarding EastFed. So the question says that Nino provided assessment of the election against the constitutional rights, and does EastFed plan to challenge the election results in the Constitutional Court? So Nino, the floor to you, and if you could also perhaps in the second part of your answer elaborate what can we hope for, even if you take it to the Constitutional Court. For example, Eka already mentioned that currently in Georgia, Georgian Dream has its grip over different constitutional bodies. So if you could touch up on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, I should say that according to our legislation, we, civil society organization, as NGO, is not authorized person to challenge these elections in the Constitutional Court. It is President of Georgia, it's the members of the parliament and public defender. So it's bad as an institution cannot do that, although we have around 300 complaints in different election administration levels, and then we are challenging some of the results and some of the things like violations in the courts. So whatever is in our hands, we are doing based on the legislation. But again, it's like the president or 1/5 of members of the parliament and public defender who can challenge it in the Constitutional Court. And second part is that whether we expect anything or not, of course, it's also another question, because unfortunately we should admit that judiciary is not independent in this country, and this is many times proved. Some of the judges are also under the US government travel bans. And so, yeah, about the judiciary, it has been long discussion how they are not independent, unfortunately. As for the next steps from our side, what was needed, we did. I mean, we are observer organization, and our main goal was to see whatever is happening and then to provide public and see and show everything. We did that. We are again challenging in the courts now whatever we can do, but next step is also very much about the opposition, how they will, next step is political already, because one is legal part of that and we are doing, but second part is political, and let's see what politicians will do. From our side, we made presentation to the international community, different observer groups, to show whatever we have seen during this period. And yeah, now we will be again showing findings, evidences, whatever we have, witnesses, our observers who undergo everything and was part of this observation mission. And let's see what will be the next thing. One thing which we did not touch is this time elections were conducted through electronic technologies. And also one thing is that whether we will have audit which will be trusted from all sides, because it was first time done through the electronic technologies and we were not part of the audit process at all. It was not transparent. Even OSCE ODIHR mentioned it in their assessment that it went without civil society, international observers or political party engagement. So this is also questionable. We might see some audit, but whether we trust or not, it's another, because questions which we wanted to ask to this audit company, and we even sent to Central Election Commission letter asking to engage us in this process. We don't know. And this is questionable because you never know what happened with the machines. I'm not proving anything. We have enough evidences about other violations, but it's also a big question considering that 90% of Georgia voted through electronic technologies.
Thank you. Let's see.
Just to add there, maybe just for a second, Elena, it's not even a speculation in many ways what might happen in the Constitutional Court. We already have the series of decisions that any lawyer, constitutionalist that be, or a good lawyer in Georgia would see, and we've had a lot of assessments of the decisions of the Constitutional Court that were completely bizarre when it comes to interpretation of the constitutional law. So it's not going to be the first case then one could be shocked, oh my God, what happened? Constitutional Court did that. It's just predictable because there's an empirical evidence of that already. And I'm afraid that even vis-a-vis an issue that relates to whether or not, if the president does not summon the first session of the parliament, which under the constitution is the only way how the first session of the parliament could be actually convened. I mean, Constitutional Court might find all the creative ways of interpretation that something else could have been a possibility as well, even though the Constitution is crystal clear. First session of the Parliament can only be convened by the President of Georgia. That's the way how Constitution says. There is no alternative to that, which Salome Zurabishvili is not planning to do.
Thank you, Eka, for that reminder. There is a question about the US upcoming elections, asking, do you think November 5 election in the US will impact how US government reacts to election results declared by the Central Election Commission of Georgia? Now, this says that this is a question for Eka, but I would also love to hear, after Eka goes, what John has to say about this. Not putting you on the spotlight, but just a little bit.
I think that in many ways, when it comes to this government of Georgia, and then no government in Georgia would have been unattentive to the elections in the US, I have to say. So it's not exclusive in this regard, because we live in a neighborhood, and a hostile neighborhood with Russia, where who sits in Washington and what is the policy of the US administration determines in so many ways what is the room of maneuverability for us to maintain our pathway of development, including when it comes to definitely membership to NATO, more rather than the EU, but beyond that as well, resilience to the challenge that emanates from Russia. But with this government, I would say it's a different type of the interest. And then when I look how Russians are usually looking who comes into the Oval Office, it's the same way of looking into it in many ways. They never care that much what Europe will say. They still, as a small country as we are, but still for them, EU is like they can be very cynical about it. Might be surprising for our audience to hear that. But they do care who comes in Oval Office, definitely, because that's the same post-Soviet or Soviet or current Russian mentality that in this polarity of the world, it matters what happens in Washington. So they are attentive to that. So I think irrespective of who comes, they will hold on right now until situation is clear to be very extreme in applying force against protesters, because you don't want to have a situation when you don't know who actually wins elections, and based on that, it might be a faux pas, so to say, that it might be a bad move that can backfire, right, when it comes to a more stronger action and pressure from the US side. So in a short term, it's just a lull, so to say, based on how the elections will go. And then based on who comes as a new administration, they will test the upcoming administration prior to inauguration, I would say, in January already. And then with small pink lines, perhaps, of bad behavior until they reach any red line, if they have that in mind, and they certainly do, because we need to be mindful that Bidzina Ivanishvili is very transparent. He already declared what is his course of action during the electoral campaign, and that's completely eliminating free space for either opposition or the civil society, for that matter, as well. But he will try. He will do as much as Russians usually do. He will not play all his cards right away, but he will break down red lines into the pink lines, so to say, and test the reaction. And I would say in that sense, these upcoming months will be very entrepreneurial from their side, trying not to overreach maybe the boundaries that could backfire, but testing the ground with both upcoming administrations. So in that regard, I'd say we are entering these uncharted waters where one needs to be very mindful. What is the room of maneuverability when it comes to the opposition section and then people in the streets, and how much one can expect a radical action with use of brutal force or not from the government to suppress that. That very much will depend how the electoral sort of week will go this week in Washington, and then what will be then the ambience of that. Contested elections, non-contested elections, and then what will be the president-elect's definition, so to say, and with that, preparations for January.
Thank you. John, coming to you with the same question.
Sure. Thank you, Eleni. Well, it definitely remains a question mark. That's to be sure. I definitely, and I certainly would like to echo Ambassador Dunnigan's sentiments and many other of our elected officials when they've consistently noted in a very public fashion that there's been bipartisan support for a democratic Georgia and for its European aspirations. So I don't see that specifically changing. It may shift in terms of the format, and obviously that is in many ways subject to international developments and those in the region. But I can't see the posture shifting dramatically in the way that Ivanishvili is stated or hopes for. I generally think he's hoping that they just sort of forget about Georgia and let them operate uninhibited, and I don't necessarily see that being the case. There is a fatigue in Washington, Brussels too, that isn't publicly discussed. There's been a lot of effort and attention paid towards Georgia, and not always paying off. I think Eka rightly noted this, particularly with respect to the Charles Michel agreement, that didn't necessarily pan out in the way everyone hoped it would. And a lot of efforts were exerted on that. But if I was going to guess, and again, I am guessing, so keep that point in mind. I think with Harris, it'll be more of a focus on democracy versus autocracy. So she'll maintain that ongoing discussion, and that'll definitely very likely take a specifically targeted approach in terms of how they deal with what may be a Georgian Dream government or a majority government if it goes in that direction. I think with Trump, the focus would be very likely more on great power politics. That wasn't really his MO when he came in 2016 or even in 2020. But we are living in a very different world today in terms of the international perspective of great powers than we were in 2016. Right, China is seen as a far greater threat by, let's say, our European allies than they were in 2016. There is a war raging on the European continent that was started by and continues to be operated by Russia, right? So in those ways, I think they're going to take probably a harsher line on their sort of broader autocratic powers because they view them as competitors. I wouldn't say that I necessarily think Georgia is a huge priority for Trump. But having said that, and I'll flesh this out, when he doesn't prioritize a place, from those I know who've worked for him or with him, he sort of tends to give it to people who do. And who are the Republicans who do focus on Georgia, right? Many of them are highly critical of Ivanishvili and his government. Many of them are foreign policy hawks, right? So I don't know that the calculation that Bidzina Ivanishvili has made that a Trump government is going to be much more forgiving, or just sort of, these kind of oligarch-like leaders buddying up. I don't see that being the case. And whatever happens, again, diverting back to my original point, there's been bipartisan support for Georgian democracy, and I think that's going to continue.
Thank you. I can see there are more questions coming in. Is there any expectations of backlash towards watchdog organizations or individual monitors from the government? This question goes to Nino, of course.
Nobody knows. We have seen it. We have experienced it during spring, whenever our offices were vandalized, our homes were vandalized. We have been receiving all these phone calls, our family members, my kids. So we never know, because we have seen the face of the ruling party, unfortunately, what they did with the civil society in spring, and I do not exclude anything, but we are here to fight for our democracy no matter what, and it's very important.
Elena, if you remember right before the elections, what happened with two very distinguished and well-known experts that are now currently experts of the Atlantic Council that are working on disinformation, not just in Georgia, but then generally Russian disinformation and fact-checking related issues in the region. And then profoundly sort of in-depth work that they do is appreciated in so many places, in addition to Georgia as well, because they do an amazing job. So when I spoke about the pink lines, this is exactly one of the examples of that. They didn't go right away arresting many people or having some false charges against many civil society representatives, but they specifically chose two experts that are not even working for a Georgian civil society organization, but an American, very well-known think tank. And then they've instituted apparent criminal charges of some financial fraud or something. It's just incomprehensible even. And they wait. What happens? What happens? And if nothing happens, that's a prelude, right? So that's how they operate. Please consider that in the same way how Russia does with pushing further all these, boundaries as well of acceptability of the action, and then creating new fait accomplis that you need to see that, okay, now it's the new reality, what we're going to do about it, annexing territories that be, or killing people outside of Russia in different foreign territories. It's the same pattern. It's the same, not just mentality, it's the same protocols of action. So I would really urge to pay significant attention to what happened with these two experts, and then how the criminal proceedings will go about it. If there is anything that U.S. Embassy or anybody else in Europe as well could influence and highlight the situation, because it's not interference in judicial processes. It's no criminal process, really. It's just cherry-picked two experts working for an American organization to test the ground, how far they can push. And I would really take it as an exemplary testing case that they've undertaken, rather than just some, one more case that we've seen, so to say, initiated against the civic organization representatives.
Thank you to both of you. And I'm seeing a couple of questions actually regarding why did the post-election protests turn out to be so small compared to the spring protests on the so-called foreign agents law. So if any of you would like to give this question a crack, please do so. Maybe just one thing from myself that I would like to mention, this is already something that our brilliant panelists said as well, is that today there is supposed to be a rally, a protest that was announced by pro-European opposition parties. They said that they would be sharing some sort of an action plan moving forwards, and there were some hints that the protest would be united, and it might be the first of many to come. But of course, we have to wait to see how it's going to go and how many people are actually going to take it to the streets.
If I may, I'll say something that I'm sure will be critically taken by the opposition, but I'm speaking as a Georgian citizen here. And I think I'm expressing views of not just one or two of my compatriots. Those who have been living in this country for a long time had a clear view that that the Georgian Dream would do everything that they could to stay in the power. And by that, I mean falsifying at a large scale elections as well. It was known already before the election day as well that electoral precincts were not open as they should have in many countries where there was a large diaspora of Georgians. They've registered to vote in the consular services because there was a clear understanding that they would vote for the opposition. That's how the opposition vote usually works, with the new voters coming in, right? So some segment of the electoral vote would have been even discounted with that simple but very powerful tool of altering the potential results of the elections, right? So I guess that there was an understanding that those who went to protest previously and then were waiting and prepping for the election as a way of continuing fight and then changing the situation that the opposition had a plan for that scenario because it was like an evident scenario that would happen. So there was an understanding that there would have been some call of what to do next because everybody thought that they would know that this would happen and they would prep something for it. And this didn't happen. So for some time, there was a little bit of a shock of what do we do now? Not unwillingness to fight for defense of the vote, but this unclarity of, is there a plan or what do we do? Then there was one very big demonstration that was called by the president. Hundreds of thousands of people came out. And then there was this announcement and call, give us some time to articulate all the violations that have happened, prep the plan, reach out to our partners, and we'll come and then we'll let you know how we need to go further, right? And then at some point, we have to understand that this is the generation that is a very civilized generation. They are ready to fight up until the end, these young generations, especially of Georgians, but they're very cultured, they're very civilized. So they took up this call for some time, I would say, to listen now to see what is it that will be offered. But I very much doubt that there will be no clear pathway of what to do, that they will just sit it out and they will say that, okay, that's fine. Nobody asked them to come out in the streets and protest and fight against the Russian law. And if nobody will lead them to protest for the stolen elections, I very much doubt that there will be just, another normal day that will come after that. And there will be some creative way of, I can't even say it, I'm 47 years old. They are much more creative than I am. So I think they will come up with some fragmented ways of unsettling the situation maybe and expressing the protest that I can't even tell what it will be because I'm not that creative as they are and organized in a different civic way as my generation has never been, even though I've been myself 14 and 13 when I've been in the streets fighting against the Soviet Union at the time. But c'est la vie. These kids are much better now, and that's only the good thing in terms of trajectory of our country. So I think that is what is happening. It's not because people accepted this reality. They are giving it a try for the opposition to come up with the plan. What is it that needs to be done? That it could be systemic and could lead some concrete results, which in a way that opposition announced itself is snap elections so that there is normalcy in terms of democratic development, which can only come through an understanding in the social fabric of this country that the result of the elections is acceptable because that reflects the majority vote of our own people, not how others see it outside, but how we see it inside. And today we don't see it like that.
Elena, if I might just add a quick point, there's a commonly expressed view in Georgia that the opposition has failed to consolidate voters. So it's fairly critical. That they've never managed to offer a viable alternative. And perhaps for some years that has been true. I've worked very closely with all of these opposition parties. I've also worked with the government, but I've worked very closely with the opposition parties for years. And I will say that despite those criticisms, this is the best I've seen them in my 7 years living in Georgia. Their messaging discipline got on track. Wasn't perfect. They made a lot of mistakes, but they did better than I've ever seen them. They managed to unify into more reasonable, value-oriented partnerships that made sense, that felt natural for voters. They could have still done better at that, but still, it was a certainly an effort that I'd never seen them engage in before, or sort of reach those degrees of consensus. Having said that, I do think that just in a public sense, and this has been verified by ours and many other public opinion researchers, and particularly focus group discussions all across the country, there's just a great sense of fatigue. People have been tired for a long time, and they've expressed that at a number of levels, and that combined with a loss, or the feeling of a loss, I think is also leading to somewhat of a sense of disillusionment. And I agree with that, that without a clear pathway, people will just dissipate. Georgian Dream, to their, well, I don't want to say credit, but they have very effectively been able to gauge over years how quickly and how easily, a crowd or a group of protesters might dissipate, and oftentimes built strategies on that. So that will, I think, in many ways hinge on just how large and what scale, the degree of protest and public disillusionment and anger is, and how long that carries on. So, that could change if the situation escalates, and if the government, to Nino's point, they carry out violent or more repressive measures. On the one hand, we don't want that to happen, but of course that could, and we have to be realistic about that. So it remains to be seen.
Thank you both. I'm vigilant of the time. There are still a couple of comments, but unfortunately, as I said, we had such a fruitful discussion that there is no more time left for the other questions. I want to thank you all, to thank our brilliant speakers for their invaluable insights, and to everyone who joined us today. It's clear that Georgia's democracy and European future are at a critical juncture, and the path forward, from what I'm hearing, will require resilience, a lot of strategic thinking on all sides, and international solidarity as well. Today's conversation highlighted that the challenges as well as the opportunities for those working to strengthen Georgian democracy, both within the country and in the partnership with the international community, are there. So let's continue to stay informed, engaged, and supportive of Georgia and the struggles that it's going through. Once again, I thank you all, and see you next time, hopefully with better news from official Tbilisi and Georgia. Have a great
last
day, everyone.
sentence, if I may. It's
Of
very
course,
important to support Georgia's people's desire to be a democratic country and to have free and fair elections. It's very important international community supports. And that's why I really call to everybody to support us in ensuring that our country is democratic and part of European future.
Thank you. I can only confirm, as a Georgian, the last comment and a very strong message from Nino. So thank you, everyone, once again. Have a great day, and hopefully see you soon. Bye.